Assalamu alaikum dear students, welcome to the 29th lecture of Public Finance. We are actually discussing various matters of Pakistan. So in the last lecture actually we discussed the resource mobilization at federal, provincial levels, and we also discussed that the elasticity and buoyancy of tax for Pakistan during the period that I mentioned, like 1980s to 1990s, were very low. That was shocking, and the reason established was basically that the government, because of the large shadow economy or unofficial sector and poor tax administration, and then we discussed the federal issues with federal tax revenue generation, and then we also discussed the provincial level and the lack of commitment at the provincial level. Then we also discussed the matter of local governments and discussed why there was a problem with the local governments and what were their major issues and what it evolved into later on. So in the current lecture, and by the end we were discussing the matter of debt and deficits, and we saw that the government went into deficit, and the main aim of the structural adjustment programs by IMF and World Bank basically was aimed towards improving the high deficit of the country, and that is where we left the lecture at that point. And we saw that with the huge government debts, there are as a result there are huge payments in terms of interest and debt servicing by the government, which causes basically the point of IMF and World Bank is that they would be causing a restraint in economic growth and high inflation. And now in the current lecture we would be discussing that scenario from this 29th lecture onwards, and the debate over debt and deficits. I said that there is a huge debate over it, and academicians and policymakers and politicians have spent extensive time and written numerous papers basically on discussing the impacts and the problems of public debt and of the fiscal deficit as such, and they have pointed out various problems with it, and they have tried to debate whether a government might go into a fiscal deficit or otherwise, or should avoid the fiscal deficit. The general concern basically is that the existing levels of budgetary deficits are abnormal and undesirable. In many OECD countries have felt the need to follow budgetary strategies that attempt to reduce and if possible eliminate the entire deficit as soon as possible. So the main this whole frame of mind is transferred into World Bank and IMF and is directed towards the developing countries like Pakistan, who are basically under the burden of debt by them, and now they are obligated to follow their conditions. The general consensus seems to be that these large current deficits are not sustainable, and that unless some forceful direct action is taken, the deficits are likely to continue growing until they swamp the entire economy. In the case of underdeveloped countries, the importance attached to fiscal deficits is even greater, and that is why, as I said, that under structural adjustment programs, the main objective of World Bank was to target Pakistan's fiscal deficit and high level of fiscal deficit, and to curtail it through, for example, improved, and to make it sustainable in a sense that the control should be made sustainable in terms of improved resource mobilization, revenue generation in other sense, improved competition in the economy, improved efficiency in the economy as a whole, so that even if they get success in removal of fiscal deficit, that removal is sustainable across time. Then the World Bank and IMF believe that fiscal deficit is the single most important policy variable that affects the rest of the economy, and they are able to express their belief through the implementation of their structural adjustment programs. the point over here is that, as I discussed in the last lecture, that previously IMF and World Bank recommended certain measures for countries like Pakistan, the developing countries, and those recommendations were, whether applied or not, that was at the discretion of the country. But once you get the credit line from those countries, that would immediately mean that now you have to follow their directions. Those are not just recommendations, but those are directions, and those were applied in Pakistan in terms of structural adjustment programs. So what is the debate over fiscal deficits, and why does the fiscal deficit matters? Do government deficit absorbs positive savings that are supposed to be invested in the economy? Do they absorb those savings? Because when the government goes into deficit, it borrows from the economy. So does that mean it either borrows or taxes extensively? So that would mean that it would reduce savings. So does the government deficit absorb positive savings? Does public debt diminish private demand for stocks of productive capital assets because of the crowding out effect? Maybe. So if there is a public debt, does it diminish the demand for of the private sector of the capital assets? Can the burden of current government expenditure be shifted to the future generation? Does it mean this, that that is why, for example, the fiscal deficit so much debated in the economic schools, economic forums, that it shifts the burden of the government expenditure on the future generations? Are inflations caused by deficits and public debts? With government borrowing does government borrowing continue to raise the interest rates? We saw two schools of thought right in our previous lectures, that on one hand, when the government borrows from the economy, that would mean there would be reduced loanable funds, and that would increase the interest rates. But then there was a Ricardian equivalence also presented by David Ricardo, which says that when people see the deficit coming by the government, they would expect government borrowing and higher taxes to pay the debts and to return the borrowed funds. So that would mean they would save more, and there won't be any effects on the interest rates. And will a tax cut mean bigger deficit while it stimulates aggregate demand, employment and output, or will it have no real consequences whatsoever? So when the government cuts the taxes, does that mean a bigger deficit, while because a tax cut actually stimulates the aggregate demand, it provides more spendable income in people's hand and economic agents as a whole, and it improves the employment and output, and so does those tax cuts do have significant consequences whatsoever? So the point is that tax cuts are important parameter to stimulate the economy by the government. It is one of the measures of the fiscal policy through which government can ensure sustainable development. But the point is that do those tax cuts, which cause bigger deficits, of course, because now the government has less revenue at hand and the expenditures are still the same. So if they have, although it stimulates the aggregate demand and improves the employment, does that mean that these tax cuts and these bigger deficits have any real effects on the economy? Now, the point is that one of the economists, William Boiter, actually made a very important statement. Probably more uninformed statements have been made on the issue of public sector debts and deficits than on any other topic in the macroeconomics, because it is one of the most highly debated topic, as I have highlighted again and again, that in macroeconomics, fiscal deficits and public debts are most highly debated topics in economics, and they have very important implications. Although we can see that economists in World Bank and IMF have had very straight school of thought in which they consider that these fiscal deficits result into, for example, low growth rate in the economy, they result into higher level of inflation, they result into, for example, crowding out of private sector. But are those views correct for each and every economy? So there have been various empirical implications and empirical studies, and to study the effect of fiscal deficits on the economy and public debts on the economic performance, and with varied results, of course. So should the budget always be balanced? Now these are the questions that I am raising in order to spark a query in your mind, so that you understand that the deficits are very important topic, and the deficits actually affect us. The government debts actually affect us. The higher taxation level to finance those deficits and debts actually affect us. The government machinery requires resources and revenues, and when they go into debt and deficit, that burden is transferred to the next generation or to us maybe. So what effect does it have on the economy? And various economists have various arguments based on that, because the converse of public debt and deficit is no debt and no deficit, and a surplus or at least a balanced budget. So if every household, the argument against that is basically against public debt and deficit is that if every household and firm should try to balance their budget, so why doesn't the government also should try to balance the budget? So does the central government is a similar economic agent as a household or a firm, or are they a different type of economic agent? Because we have discussed the provision of public goods, we have discussed the provision of national defense, we have discussed the provision of environmental protection laws. So all these things are not provided by the private sector, and all these things are not paid for by the private sector, and all these things do not have returns in terms of for example cash returns. So government has to provide those goods which cannot be easily packaged and sold in the economy. We discussed that in terms of the public goods. So where do they generate finance for those public goods, and where do they mobilize the resources for those public goods? No doubt whenever they take debt from the economic system, then there is an opportunity cost of those funds being taken by the government. But the point is that where the government is utilizing those funds, is it necessary for the government to do that? So can we associate the performance of the central government or life of a central government as the life of a household or a firm, or we cannot? An appropriate way to maintain fiscal discipline without stabilizing the economy would be to determine the level of government spending on its own merits, regardless of considerations for the because certain time, as we discussed, the tax cuts result into boosting up of the economy. So whenever the government feels that there is the requirement of stimulate the economy, it might run into a deficit because of a tax cut. So if they run into a deficit because of a tax cut, then that they are actually stabilizing the economy. So one appropriate way to consider the fiscal discipline is to separate the stabilization part of the economy in consideration of government spending on its own merits, independent of the requirement of stabilization, and to set tax rates to produce a balance at full employment level. So the point over here is to set aside the stabilization requirements of government actions and keep the taxation policy in line to balance the budget, rather than going into deficit or surplus just to stabilize the economy, to keep the two halves separate. Then there is an economist who argues, James Tobin argues that federal deficits may even be economically desirable in specific circumstances, and what is really important is appropriate public policy which may or may not produce a budget balance. However, he argues that making deficits unconditional would increase economic instability. As I discussed earlier, actually this is the point which I have been discussing again and again, that it is not as such the public deficit that matters. Actually it is the main public policy behind it, that why that public deficit was that event of a public deficit came up. If that spending by the government is on some project or some type of expenditure which would give positive returns in the future, then that deficit is worthwhile. But if that deficit, actually I belong to the same school of thought, because if those deficits are for example for operational expenditures and for recurring expenditures, then that deficit would be a burden to the economy and to the burden to the next generation. But if those deficits, for example, are for better healthcare facilities or for better education and schooling, which would produce a more you can say better and educated and skilled labor force in the future, if those deficits are, for example, run to provide, for example, you can say any better development project, for example building dams or building infrastructure which would be utilized and would give returns in the future, then that deficit is worthwhile. But on the other hand, if that deficit is incurred due to, for example, foreign tours, or for example expensive cars or expensive hoteling or expensive housing, then those deficits would be a burden to the economy. So if you take out the deficits of the equation, and if you as the previous argument was, that if you separate the stability requirements of the economy and you ensure that the budgets are always balanced, that would create further economic instability in the economy, because fiscal policy is one of the tools highlighted even by John Maynard Keynes, that fiscal policy is one of the major tools that actually controls the business cycle of the economy. Then if you separate them, then there would be more economic instability. Now then, about the problem of measuring the deficit, Robert Eisner and Piper argue that conventional measures of fiscal deficits and debt are fundamentally flawed. In their analysis, they correct the figures for debt of changes in the market value of government debt due to changes in interest rates and changes in the real value due to inflation. And they find these adjustments and measurements critical to their findings. Failure to measure deficits correctly has not only contributed to a false view of fiscal importance, but has possibly led to an overestimate of importance of money. The point over here is, which these authors identify through their analysis, is that if fiscal deficits are not properly measured, actually government debts are not valued in terms of current market interest rates. The problem would be that the overemphasis of certain economists on balanced budget, or overemphasis of certain group on for example against fiscal deficits or government debts, might be result of this flawed evidence, which they highlighted, that if it is not adjusted for the interest rates, then it would be failure to measure deficit correctly has not only contributed to a false view of fiscal impotence, but has possibly led to an overestimate of importance of money. Now then, the second debate is, apart from the stabilization policy and the fiscal deficit by the government, the second debate is about the transfer of burden to the next generation. As you see on the slide, Lahori actually asks the important questions of whether increasing debt finance is adding an increasing unfair burden on the future generations. If the answer is in affirmative, then one may conclude that present generation are benefiting by consuming services provided currently, while future generations will have to foot the bill, hence one should not borrow. So as I said earlier, that we might be on the basis of this argument, that if our previous generation actually ran deficits regularly and they financed it using debt or higher taxation, which is a burden on us right now, so that would mean that our excessive expenditure and in the presence of less revenue would result into for example excessive burden on the future generations. So in that sense, if you consider that the current for example expenditure of the current generation is a burden on the future generation, then in that case a balanced budget would be one of the main arguments. On the other hand, one may be able to argue that by borrowing now, there will be greater intergenerational equity, since part of the cost of capital outlay will be passed on to the future, because capital outlays would be resulting into more productive for example more income in the future. So if they would also be benefiting from the income that we have incorporated in terms of the deficit that we have run, so that would mean that they should also share the burden, that is by they I mean the future generation. Now the answer to this question, whether debt is passed on to the future generation, depends critically on the definition of the burden of debt. Now, Modigliani's definition rests on the assumption that a permanent increase in government debt would crowd out the private investment in the long run, causing net decrease in the capital stock. Now, you see, there are again various schools of thought by various economists. At first, we discussed the view that the budget should be balanced, keeping the stabilization policy and budgetary requirements of the government on two separate ends. Then we discussed that there was a budget implication of borrowing, and that would result a burden in the future generation. But then there is the third argument by Modigliani. Definition rests on the assumption that a permanent increase in government borrowing debt would crowd out private sector. When they would borrow from the economy, the interest rates would go up, and when the interest rates would go up, that would automatically mean that the private sector cannot acquire the capital stock at the higher interest rate, and that would crowd them out. So because the government has taken away most of the funds, so that would reduce private sector involvement in the economy. So all these various schools of thought are debating over the implication of fiscal deficit and public debt by the government. Now, my view is, in this perspective, if you look at all of these, for example, stabilization policy, keeping it aside, for example, intergenerational, you can say, as Tobin said, that it is the public policy which matters. So if it is an intergenerational burden, that if the future generation is getting benefits of that deficit that we run today, then future generation should also be paying for it also, because they are getting the better return. And the same case is over here, that if the government deficit is crowding out the private sector but giving a net return in the long run, that deficit is providing, for example, productive gains in the future. Even if it crowd out the private sector for now, then even that would be beneficial, at least in my view. Now, of course, you have your own views to establish in this regard. Then the IMF and World Bank, as I said earlier, are agreed on one point, that dealing with budget deficit is one of the most vexing problems for the majority of underdeveloped countries, and hence fiscal policy is now an essential component of adjustment programs, where fiscal discipline and restraint are viewed as prerequisites for macroeconomic stabilization. They have the sole focus, or their main objective is that whenever the government runs deficit, they have consideration that results into higher inflation rates, that result into, for example, slowdown of economic growth, that results into crowding out of the private sector. So it is not beneficial for the economy, and that is basically the whole view prevailing across the IMF and World Bank, and that is reflected in their structural adjustment programs being applied on each and every country that they apply it on, and that was represented by the recommendations they gave to Pakistan before the structural adjustment programs, and that is being represented in the structural adjustment programs that are being implemented in the country. Many observers argue that the fiscal deficit is a useful indicator of overall economic performance, and have found a significant statistical relationship between the deficit and many, though not all, macroeconomic performance variables. So there is another school of thought, again, as I said, that it is the most debated topic in economics, that many observers might say that fiscal deficit also result into a positive relationship between many other performance variables, for example, economic growth or decrease in inflation. So decrease in rate of inflation, which we would see that is the case for Pakistan specifically, and no crowding out of the private sector. So fiscal deficit, if that deficit is run while providing the infrastructure for the economy, if that deficit is run, for example, while improving the social sector of the economy, then that deficit is worthwhile, at least in my view. But on the other hand, the view of IMF and World Bank would say that they are against the fiscal deficit as a whole, and they are against, they treat the budget deficit or fiscal deficit as a sign of excessive government expenditure, or maybe excessive government involvement in the economy. And maybe that is the reason that they are, for example, so much focused on removing the high fiscal deficits from the economy. economies in which they implement the structural adjustment programs. Now, the budget deficit is held responsible for high inflation, low growth in the economy, current account deficit, and crowding out of the private investment and consumption, which I have highlighted again and again. The main aim of repeating these things is that they are actually imprinted on your mind, and since this debate is very interesting, and this debate has very long history in macroeconomics, you should also be a part of it. The relationship between deficits and other macroeconomic variable is said to depend on how the deficits financed. And again, I would also add that how deficits are incurred, why deficits are incurred in fact. If again deficits are incurred while building dams or roads or improving the labor force, then those deficits would be worthwhile, at least in my view. And then the other view is that these deficits it also depends on how these deficits are financed. Either there is excessive taxation, or there is for example printing of more money, or there is for example debts by the government. So that is why I said that there is a difference between public debt and fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is when the expenditure exceeds the revenue, the government runs a deficit. And now the point is that how they finance that deficit, whether they borrow domestically, whether they borrow from external sources like foreign sources like IMF and World Bank, and what would be the implications of those borrowings. And the point is that how they finance them later on, that either they for example try to generate revenue from their own sources, or they increase the level of taxation to finance those debts and deficits. Now, critical concerns regarding Pakistan deficits. Now, I would summarize the main features over here of Pakistan's public finance and fiscal policies, which are total expenditure. This is the whole image of Pakistan right now being presented, which is the critical concerns basically of the international organizations, as well as what we extract from the statistics of public finance over here. The total expenditure exceeds total revenue, and the growth in expenditure is greater than the growth in revenue. Current expenditure alone exceeds total revenue actually. Development expenditure has been falling while current expenditure has grown. You would see that in a table very soon. Development expenditure, I hope you remember all these points because we would be looking at them in the form of a table. Development expenditure has been falling while current expenditure has grown. Defense expenditure has been very high and much higher than even the development expenditure. Now let me restate those so that we remember them when we look at that slide of statistics. Total expenditure exceeds the total revenue, and the growth in total expenditure is greater than the growth in total revenue. So that would automatically mean that gap would widen in the future. Current expenditure alone exceeds the total revenue. Development expenditure, which is other than the current expenditure, has been falling while current expenditure has grown. Defense expenditure has been very high and much higher than the development expenditure. Interest payments along with defense expenditure constitute more than half of the annual expenditures by the government. The main source for financing the fiscal deficit has been non-bank borrowing rather than the bank borrowing. Domestic debt is greater than the foreign debt. The financing of the deficit is very substantial from domestic sources rather than from the foreign sources. The fiscal deficit of the government of Pakistan has been around 8% of GDP for much of the 1980s. So if we move on to summary of fiscal policy statistics as a percentage of GDP, we can look over here. That is from 1980, 81, 80s average, 80s highest and lowest, then 90s average, 90s highest and lowest, and then 2001, 2001 and 2001 and 2. So if we look at it, then the total revenue has been almost stagnant at 16.9%, around 16-17%. It has climbed to 19.2, which is the 90s highest, and the total expenditure is around 22-25%. Now the gap has widened. The current expenditure is in some cases it is, for example, for 80s highest was 20.3, while the total revenue for 80s was 18.6. So only the current expenditure has increased than the total revenue. Forget the total expenditure like development and all that. So in many instances you can see that the current expenditure is greater than the total revenue that is being generated. Then there is debt servicing by the government, which has increased. Debt servicing is payment of interest payments as well as the certain amount of debt that they return. So debt servicing has increased from 1980, which was 2.1 to 7.2% of the GDP in 2001 and 2. And then there is defense expenditure, which is it seems to be stagnant around 5 or 6% of the GDP, which is considering that debt servicing has increased and total expenditure has increased. Then the defense expenditure should be, or current expenditure has increased, then defense expenditure should be reducing. But on the other hand, you can see that it has increased. Then the other part of the total expenditure is the development expenditure, which has reduced from 9.3% in 1980s to 3.5% in 2001 and 2. It was only 2.1% in 2001 and 2, fiscal year 2001 and 2. Then you can see that the deficit is around 5.3% in 1980s, 5.2% in 2001 and 2, and 5.2% in 2001, 6.6% in 1999 and 2000. So it is around, it has increased to 8.7% in certain cases, which is the highest of 1980s, and 8.8%, which is the highest of 1990s. So you can see over here that overall picture represents that the defense expenditure has been a major part, and debt servicing has been a major part of the total expenditure, while when you add them up, they constitute almost 50% of the current expenditure of the government. Then development expenditure has reduced a lot, and government has been going into deficit around, which is around 5, 6 and 7% of the GDP, which might be 8% for certain instances. Now further from this table, we also extract this information. Total revenue has remained with some variation over time, more or less the same in 22 years, despite reforms of different sorts, despite the reforms by the government, despite the you can say despite reforms by the government, despite so many structural adjustments, structural changes in the economy, the total revenue has almost remained stagnant as a percentage of GDP. Total expenditure no doubt has fallen across the time. These are the extractions from the table, and in the previous slide we discussed the main points highlighted by various reports on Pakistan, and then we saw the table, and now we are extracting information from the table ourselves. Although total expenditure has fallen, current expenditure has actually risen and as a percentage of GDP. Debt servicing has increased over time. Defense expenditure has fallen over time, but still it is not exactly fallen, but in percentage points that is not enough. But the total defense expenditure has increased, but as a percentage of GDP you can see that it has fallen. Development expenditure has fallen very dramatically as a percentage of GDP as such, and I guess maybe in total numbers also. The budget deficit has been brought down to early 1980s level, that is in 2002, but later on it has increased a lot again. As against the various implications or various scenarios given by IMF and World Bank and various reports when they focus on fiscal deficits, and we discuss the various views of various economists, that it results into crowding out, it results into inflation, it results into low growth. Then what I would like to highlight over here is that in this table you can see gross domestic product, inflation, current account deficit and budget deficit all together in one table, and over here you can see on the left side there is growth rate in percentage, there is as percentage of GDP, and there is defense expenditure, development expenditure, interest payments and budget deficits as percentage of GDP for the period 1960 to 2002 and 2003, the times that we have been discussing. Now if you look at it, the GDP growth rate, for example in the first column from 1960s has been around 6 or 7%. On average it was 6.8% in 1960s. 1960s was the highest growth rate period in Pakistan's history, and also same was the Zia's regime prior to structural adjustment program was also a high growth rate regime. Then it is from 6.8% to 5.1%. When you look at this growth rate and you see the effect of budget deficit, the budget deficit actually you see over here that they might be correlated, and the situation for Pakistan is much different from all the other countries, or as portrayed by IMF and World Bank. The budget deficit or the fiscal deficit, which is shown in the last column as a percentage of GDP, actually has caused a reduction from 7% to 8%, or around 7 or 6, and then it has reduced to 3.7%. While on the other hand, Pakistan has maintained a much stable growth around 5 or 6% in the GDP. Then if you see the rate of inflation, then you see that it started from 1960s, it was 3.8%. It increased to 10.8%, 11.8, 1950 and 1995s and around 1990s. And then it has reduced again in 2001 and 2002, around 3.1 and 3.5%. So then again, if you see the private investment, then they would assume that there is crowding out of private investment, but if you see it over here, private investment has not been crowded out in case of Pakistan, because if you see as the growth rate in private investment, or it as a percentage of GDP, has improved a lot. That is private investment as a part of as a percentage of GDP, which is column number 7, and that shows that the private investment has increased from 7.2 to a huge level of 11.3% and 11.2% of the GDP. Now that would mean, on the other hand, because the budget deficits, Pakistan has been running deficits for quite a long time now, so that would mean that private investment should have reduced, they should have been crowded out, inflation should have increased, which is not the case over here, and the growth rate of the GDP, for example, should have reduced, but it has been maintained at 5 or 6% of the GDP up to 2002. So if you see the budget deficit in comparison to that, then you see a total different perspective. And in my view, if you see the Keynesian perspective, that would be that government involvement in the, not exactly involvement, or government interventions in the economy in terms of fiscal policies might result into, for example, they might run deficit for development of infrastructure, building of motorways, dams, or for example various projects of provision of infrastructure to the economy. So if that is the case, then these investments, these involvements in the economy might stimulate the economy also. So Pakistan currently over here, it represents the true picture of the Keynesian perspective, that involvement of the government is very necessary for improvement in the system. And the same has been admitted by IMF and World Bank in case of Pakistan, and their statement is mentioned in columns over here, and I would read that once. The macro consequences of fiscal deficit in Pakistan have apparently been quite dissimilar from those in other developing countries with fiscal deficits of comparable magnitude. Now, their point highlighted over here is that the whole school of thought presented by IMF and World Bank is that fiscal deficits might result into reduced growth, it might result into increased level of inflation, it might result into crowding out of the private sector, which is not the case in case of Pakistan, because the high fiscal deficits represent a different situation, and the implications are dissimilar as compared to other countries of the similar level of fiscal deficits. Now, specifically, Pakistan has experienced neither hyperinflation nor debt rescheduling. Growth has remained quite strong through the last 2 decades. Inflation has not been high, and the current account deficit has averaged about 2% of the GNP, remaining largely financeable and not posing debt servicing problems for the country. Now, they actually agree that in case of Pakistan, the situation is very different, because our fiscal, this was in terms of the fiscal deficit from the period of 1980 to 1997, keep that in your mind. So if Pakistan ran fiscal deficits, then those fiscal deficits should have caused, for example, hyperinflation, and should have caused, and that level of fiscal deficit which we saw over here, and they might have caused hyperinflation, they might have caused curtailed economic growth, they might have caused crowding out of the private sector, that there is private sector does not because it increased the interest rate. So that would, when the government borrows the money out of the economy, that would mean that lesser resources are left for capital investments by private sector. So this is what should happen, but that is not the case in terms of Pakistan, and the situation is different. So the fiscal deficits have not curtailed any economic growth in Pakistan. The IMF believes that the deficit has not behaved in Pakistan as it should have in the period for several reasons. Now they assign different reasons for why the behavior of fiscal deficits in Pakistan has been different, and here is a list of those reasons which we would discuss now. There was a high rate of growth of real output, 6% per annum, which permitted a fairly rapid expansion of both interest-bearing and non-interest-bearing debt without recourse to inflationary finance. The equilibrium deficit was quite high, 5.5% of GDP, despite a low inflation rate, because of a very high underlying rate of growth of real GDP, because real GDP was growing at a high rate. So the inflation rate, despite low inflation rate, because of very high underlying rate of growth of GDP, so despite the higher level of deficit, the government could manage that. And the most important of all is the government of Pakistan was able to borrow both domestically and externally at rates below the marginal cost of funds in the international and private capital markets. So that also, because the rate was well below the marginal cost of those rates, and so that is why these borrowings did not result into inflationary pressure on the economy. They did not result into, for example, crowding out of the private sector. And one of the important factors, as we saw in our previous slides, is that the government placed its focus on national savings, and the main source of one of the main source, for example, 45.1% in 2002 of the share of total debt was unfunded debt, and from their perspective, from IMF's perspective, it might have caused the crowding out effect, but it did not. So the result was that the economy was growing, and there was low levels of inflation despite a higher level of fiscal deficit. Now, continuing this all debate, what I did was that I used Economic Survey of Pakistan 2013 and 14 to see what the current situation is, so that we are very up to date on the information. And we previously we have discussed all the theoretical foundations of government finance, its implication, its role in the economy, importance of the government role in the economy, then government, for example, expenditure as well, and then government revenue generation in terms of government finance. We discussed all that. Then we discussed the economy of Pakistan using the book Issues of Pakistan's Economy by S. Akbar Zaidi, and we discussed up to the point, as I said, that book was published in 2005. So we discussed up to the point of 2000 with statistics up to 2002 or 2003. Now what we should do is that we also should pick up the latest statistics and see where what happened in the economy. So Economic Survey of Pakistan actually presents the true picture of the economy in terms of the latest developments in the fiscal and monetary sector. So we would continue with the fiscal development. Present government, soon after coming into power in June 2013, took instant measures to improve the fiscal situation through expenditure management strategy and raising tax and non-tax revenue during fiscal year 2013 and 14. So because the present government, which came into power in June 2013, it immediately took certain measures to improve. On one hand, they did expenditure management of they started prudent expenditure management management strategies to reduce the expenditures and started cuts on budgets of various ministries and divisions. And on the other hand, they focused on revenue generation and revenue collection through tax and non-tax revenues during the fiscal year. Under prudent fiscal expenditure management strategy, various initiatives have been taken, including 30% cut in current budget of ministries and divisions, except pay and allowances, phasing out of electricity subsidies, and announced restructuring of bleeding public sector enterprises. So the main thing was that the main fiscal steps and fiscal developments taken by the current government were that they focused on generation of tax and non-tax revenues. Non-tax revenues in a sense that they, for example, restructuring of public sector enterprises and improve the revenue collection from them, and then they reduce the public expenditure by phasing out the electricity subsidies that are being provided, and they also reduce the expenditure by putting 30% cuts on spending on current budgets by of ministries and divisions. So they try to balance the equation from both sides. On the one hand, they try to improve the revenue generation, resource mobilization, and on the other hand, they reduce the expenditure side of the government. Then, as a result of these efforts, initial gains started to emerge as fiscal deficit reduced to 3.2% of GDP during July and March, against 4.7%, which was comparable 4.7% July and March of 2013 and 2012 and 13 last year. So they reduced the fiscal deficit to 3.2%, which was a very important step or milestone in, for example, in terms of the development of the country. Now, total expenditure of rupees 5,297 billion was estimated for the full year, comprising of 3,963 billion of current expenditure, 74.8% of the total, and 1334.3 billion of development expenditure and net lending. So the total expenditure, actually 75% almost expenditure was from the current expenditure by the government, and 25.2% of the total expenditure was for development. This is another further improvement in a sense that a huge part of the expenditure was dedicated to the development expenditure. Moving on, during July and March 2013 and 14, total expenditures contained at 3.7% against 20.4% growth in the same period of 12. So actually what we are doing over here is we are comparing. Through this comparison, actually we are getting statistics for the 2 year. There was a 20.4% growth in 2012 and 13 in the government expenditure, and only a 3.7% growth in the expenditure, total expenditure in the government 2013 and 14. So we are not only comparing the financial year of 2013 and 14 with financial year of 12-13, but we are also getting the statistics for 2 different years in terms of public finance. Now, the main thing, the most interesting and important implication of this government's effort was that there was increase in total revenue, which increased by 16.6% during the current financial year, and stood at 2477 billion compared to 21249 billion in the same period of 2012 and 13. So there was a huge revenue generation effort by the government, and they increased the total revenue by 16.6%. Then tax revenues amounted to 1786 billion against 1527 billion in the same period last year, thus posted a growth of 16.9% in terms of the tax revenue. Significant growth in tax revenue was mainly on account of considerable rise in federal tax collection by 16.3%. So that would mean that federal tax revenue mobilization increased by 16.3%, which we had discussed earlier in our previous lectures, while non-tax revenue posted a significant growth of 15.8%, which is a huge improvement in the non-tax revenue generation. It amounted to 691 billion against 597 billion in the same period in the last year. Then fiscal accounts witnessed some relief on account of reduced subsidies, which remained lower than the last year. Now keep in mind that IMF and World Bank are pushing the government of Pakistan to reduce the subsidies on electricity and gas and all the utilities being provided to the public, and because we discussed that these subsidies distort the efficiency in the economy, and with reduced prices, for example, the demand curve shift upwards, and people consume more than they should, so and that they would normally do, so that results into excess burdens in the economy, and that results into efficiency losses. And we discussed that in graphical perspective, considering the example of housing being subsidized by the government, and that is why the IMF and World Bank are insisting on the government to reduce the subsidies on various public utilities specifically, or subsidies in terms of fuel or fuel provision or petrol or diesel, for example. So that removal of subsidies is one of the major part of reducing the fiscal deficit, and this government, for example, 2013 and 14 witnessed relief on account of reduced subsidies, which remained lower than the last year, as it reached to 201.8 billion during July 13-14 against 270 billion in the comparable period of 12-13. Following a growth of 24.3% in provincial tax revenues and 13.9% in federal transfers, the provincial surpluses posted a higher growth at reached to 257.9 billion during July-March 2013 and 14. So the federal tax effort and their resource mobilization improved, and they showed a growth of 24.3% in provincial tax revenues and 13.9% growth in federal transfers to the provinces, also resulted into surplus surplus to provinces, and the surplus reached to 257.9 billion in the current financial year. Now again, during July-April 2013-14, FBR collected an amount of 1,744 billion as provincial tax against rupees 1,505.5 billion in comparable period, reflecting a growth of around 15.9%. So this is another example of improved tax effort by the government, representing an increase of 15.9% in terms of collection of provisional tax. During the first 10 months of current fiscal year, among the four federal taxes, highest growth has been witnessed in direct tax 18.9%, followed by sales tax at 18.8% and federal excise at 14%. Now again, highlighting the same old issue that we have discussed time and again, that direct taxes should be, for example, a greater part of the government revenue rather than the indirect taxes, which are basically the consumption taxes by the government. So over here we saw a considerable increase in the direct taxes, which is 18.9%, followed by an increase in the sales tax, which is 18.8%, and a federal excise duty showed a growth of 14%. We need to see further statistics on direct tax revenue during the same period, July to April 2013 and 14. Direct taxes remained a major source of FBR tax revenue collection, amounting to 37.7% of total FBR revenue. Now you see over here, 37.7% of the total FBR revenue was the direct taxes, and the remaining part was indirect taxes. No doubt there was a growth in the direct tax collection, but still the economy should be depending more on the direct taxes rather on the indirect taxes. Net collection was estimated at rupees 658.1 billion against 553 billion in the comparable period of the last fiscal year. Indirect taxes increased by 14.2% in the first 10 months of current fiscal year, accounted for 62.2% of the total revenue collection by the Federal Bureau of Revenue, which I just said that direct taxes are 37.7% of the total revenue collected by FPR, and 62.2% are indirect tax revenue collected by FPR. Net collection was estimated to be 1,086 billion against 951 billion in the same period last year. Comparable to the last year, the revenue collection was a very significant growth, and there is 14.2% growth in the first 10 months of the current fiscal year in terms of indirect taxes. But the point is still the same, that direct tax revenue should be a greater part of the total tax revenue as compared to the indirect tax revenue. We would continue the discussion on this part of the lecture, where I am discussing the current statistics of and highlighting the major, basically taking out the major highlights of Economic Survey of Pakistan and posting them to you, so that we would continue the discussion of the public finance and various implications of the government actions and how the government is reducing the deficits and debts. And we would continue with that in the next lecture, because we are short of time now. So I would recommend, rather I would what I would do is that we would turn to the summary of the current lecture, and which was one of the very important lectures, considering the debt and deficits. And the current amount of public debt and deficits would be debt specifically would be, public debt would be discussed from Economic Survey of Pakistan, would be discussed in the next lecture. I wished we could have covered that right now, but we would take it to the next lecture. Now there is a great amount of work, extensive time spent, various articles written by economists on the debate over debts and deficits and how they affect the economy. And there is a general concern that existing level of debts and deficits prevailing across OECD countries, some of the OECD countries, is very detrimental to their economic well-being, and it would cause low growths in the future. And if that is the case for OECD countries, which are like high income countries mostly, then what would happen to, for example, developing countries? The situation would be more severe for them. So the general consensus is to be that these large current deficits are not sustainable, and unless some forceful or direct action is taken, these deficits are likely to continue growing and swamp the whole economy. So in the case of underdeveloped countries, the problem is even severe. So based on this implication, based on this ideology, the World Bank and IMF take it as their aim to recommend to the governments for the reduction of high fiscal deficits, because they consider that fiscal deficits are detrimental to the economic well-being, or to detrimental to economic growth, and cause high inflation rates and crowd out the private sector, which again results into lesser growth in the future, so creating a cycle. So they would recommend such measures to many countries, and then later on, when they apply the structural adjustment programs to a few chosen countries like Pakistan, who are bound to listen to IMF and World Bank, they ensure that such measures are taken in which expenditures of the governments are reduced and revenues are increased and subsidies are reduced, so that to reduce the inefficiency in the economy, and indirect taxes are reduced, and maybe the direct taxes are improved in the economy, so that to reduce the inefficiency overall. We specifically discussed the impact of direct and indirect taxes. Direct taxes actually shifts your, for example, an income tax would reduce your income and would not cause inefficiency, but for example, an indirect tax or a sales tax, for example, would pivot the budget line to one point and then move it along the other axis, and that would result into lower level of utility for the individual and inefficiency in the market as a whole. So does the fiscal deficit matter? That was the debate that we discussed in this, that does the fiscal deficit absorb positive savings? Does public debt diminish private demand for capital? Does the burden of government current expenditure be shifted to future generations? Is it shifted to the future generations? Are inflation, higher level of inflation caused by government debts and public debts or fiscal deficits? does government borrowing raise the interest rates, and are tax cuts and will a tax cut mean bigger deficit, tax cut resulting into a bigger deficit, and that tax cut which stimulates the economy and increase the aggregate demand, employment and output, and does it have any real consequences? So again, a very big debate that that has arisen in the economic school of thoughts, and that has caused various arguments by various economists, and based on which William Whiter actually very interestingly said that probably most uninformed statements have been made on the issue of public sector debts and deficits than on any other topic in the macroeconomics. So it is a widely debated topic, and if we look what the debate revolves around, that debate revolves around the concept that whether the government should go into a deficit or should not go into a deficit, whether the government should behave like a household or a firm balancing its budget, or should or is the government different than a household and a firm. As I said, that government provides public goods which are not easily packaged and sold in the market. So how can it finance those goods if it is treated as a household or a firm? Now, then one of the arguments is that an important way to stabilize the to maintain a fiscal discipline is to keep the stabilization policies like tax cuts and subsidies on the side, and then consider only the government expenditure and government revenue separately without consideration of stabilizing the economy. But on the other hand, James Tobin argues that if stabilization is kept as separate, then it would cause further instability in the economy, because if such type of scenario is considered, that government expenditure and taxes are vamped just to cover the government expenditure and not to consideration for the stabilization policies, then also that what is really important is appropriate public policy which may or may not produce a balanced budget. The main thing is that why a balanced budget or why not a balanced budget is being produced. That is the question to ask. The question is not whether government should or should not go into a deficit. The question is that what is the reason that the government is going to a deficit, and why it should go into a deficit. That is the question basically. Then basically the main another argument was that whether the deficit is for example results into an intertemporal distribution of the burden. Does the current generation's burden is transferred to the next generation? That is one of the main questions. So under that we discussed that it would be fruitful, for example, in case if the current future generation is also reaping the benefits from the current deficit, from any projects which resulted into a current deficit, then they should bear the burden as well. And then the last argument was that permanent increase in government debt would crowd out the private sector and then reduce their investments, and then obviously reduce the growth or growth through the private sector involvement. So all these three arguments point to the question that in my view at least, which I have highlighted over here, that basically it is the reason why the government is going into deficit the most important question to ask, rather than whether the government should go or should not go into a deficit. The reason should maybe if it is a development project, if it is a project which would give, for example, if the government of Pakistan goes into a deficit building dams, and it borrows a debt or a fund from a foreign entity and it would build dams, then those dams would provide electricity, and that electricity would again provide infrastructure for investments, and provide infrastructure would improve the production in the economy and would result into higher level of GDPs. And even if that higher level of income, some part of higher taxation is used to extract that higher level of income and bear the burden of that debt, then those deficits would be or those for example public debts would not hinder economic growth, in my view at least. The IMF and World Bank are agreed upon that basically fiscal policy is one of the main tools that is being focused, that should be focused upon for all the governments, and main thing is that these deficits result into lower level of growth, higher level of inflation and crowding out. This is the view of IMF and World Bank. And then many observers might argue that fiscal deficit is a useful indicator of overall economic performance, and found a significant relationship between deficit and many other economic variables. Again the same thing. And then critical concerns regarding Pakistan. If we look at the budgetary implications and the critical concerns raised against the fiscal discipline of Pakistan, total expenditure exceeds total revenue, current expenditure alone exceeds total revenue, development expenditure has been falling, defense expenditure has been very high and more than the development expenditure. Interest payment along with defense expenditure constitute more than half of the annual expenditure. Main source of financing fiscal deficit has been non-bank borrowing rather than bank borrowing, which is again a criticism by the international agencies that it results into a crowding out, but maybe that is one of the reasons that why there is lower level of inflation along with a higher fiscal deficit. Domestic debt is greater than the foreign debt. The financing of deficit is very substantially from domestic sources rather than from foreign sources. The fiscal deficit of the government of Pakistan has been around 8% of the GDP for much of 1980s. Then we saw this table in which we compared the budget deficit and movements in for example with the total revenue, total expenditure, and saw various differences. And then we discussed further important point that we extracted from this table, that total revenue has remained with some variations over time, more or less the same across 22 years. Total expenditure has no doubt fallen, but the current expenditure has actually increased. Debt servicing has increased over time. Defense expenditure has fallen over time. Don't consider that this was the percentage of GDP. Defense expenditure has fallen as a percentage of GDP. That does not mean that the total monetary value of the defense expenditure has fallen, because the GDP has increased over time. Now development expenditure has fallen very dramatically. The budget deficit has been brought down to early 1980s level. Then we looked at this table to discuss the implications of deficits of Pakistan's government on economic growth and inflation and private investments, and we saw that Keynesian perspective was purely at play over here, because even the World Bank and IMF would agreed that 1980 to 1997 the macro consequences of fiscal deficits in Pakistan have not apparently been quite dissimilar from those in other developing countries with fiscal deficits of almost the similar level. Specifically, Pakistan has not run into hyperinflation. Pakistan's economic growth has been sustained, and then the current account deficit has averaged across 2% of GDP, largely remaining financeable and not posing debt servicing problems for the country. And then they assign reasons to why this is the case for Pakistan. Why is Pakistan different from many other developing countries? There was a high rate of growth of real output, one of the reasons, which fairly permitted a fairly rapid expansion of both interest-bearing and non-interest-bearing debt without recourse to inflationary finance. I hope you remember what is inflationary finance. That is by printing more money. Because there has been growth in real output and rapid expansion of both interest-bearing and not interest-bearing debt, so there was no reason for inflationary finance. The equilibrium deficit was quite high, 5.5% of GNP, despite low inflation rate because of a very high underlying rate of economic growth, real GDP growth. The government of Pakistan was able to borrow both domestically and externally at rates considerably below the marginal cost of the funds, and that also resulted into, because the borrowing cost was low, so that resulted into much stable growth. Then we started to discuss the fiscal and monetary policy of economic survey of Pakistan, and we saw various highlights in which we discussed that the current government actually increased the tax effort by increasing the tax and non-tax revenue, increased the revenue effort actually, increasing the tax and non-tax revenue, and they reduced the expenditure of the government, specifically 30% of the total current expenditure for various ministries and divisions, and then they also phased out the electricity subsidies, and they restructured certain public sector enterprises to ensure improvement in to ensure efficiency. Then we discussed that initial gains, fiscal deficit reduced to 3.2% as against 4.7% under the previous government, and then there is the current expenditure was 74.8% of the total, and the development expenditure was 25.2% 16.2% of the total expenditure. We also discussed that during this government, total expenditure contained at 3.7% against 20.1% growth. The growth in total expenditure was much lower than the previous financial year. Total revenue increased by 16.6% in the current financial year, which was much more than the previous. Then one of the important implications that I want to highlight over here is that was in terms of the direct and indirect tax, which said that the direct tax revenue actually was 37.7% of the total revenue collected by Federal Bureau of Revenue, and the indirect tax revenue was 62.2% of the total revenue collected by the Federal Board of Revenue. So having discussed all this, we saw that there is considerable improvement in the current situation of the economy in terms of revenue generation, and reduction in terms of expenditure, and reduction in terms of subsidies also. We also discussed over here is that the government also reduced subsidies on electricity and other subsidized items, and which actually we discussed in our theoretical part, that subsidies result into inefficiency, and that is why the IMF and World Bank and the government is of the view that subsidies should be reduced and phased out very slowly. So the current government also reduced certain subsidies in the economy as well. So we would continue this discussion on economic survey of Pakistan on the latest one in the next lecture.